All right, this is Openstax U.S. History, Chapter 4, Section 3, An Empire of Slavery and the Consumer Revolution. So Chapter 4, let me go ahead and get my pen here. Chapter 4 is more or less looking at the English colonies from 1660 up until 1760. And this is, the years or the 100 years leading up to the American Revolution. And Section 3 talks about two major themes. The first one being slavery, the second one being the consumer revolution or the economy. We've talked about slavery already, and one important thing to keep in mind is that when it comes to English slavery, it is an economic system in terms of making money, but it also has its effects on politics, and this is the way that laws or the legal system defines slavery. And in colonies like Virginia, especially in the aftermath of Bacon's Rebellion, if you recall, was a very important event which led to the rise of specifically African slavery, that the law and the legal system came to treat whites and blacks differently, creating a society based off of what we might call a racial caste society. And if we were to draw a social pyramid that correlated with that, in those colonies, it would mean that if you were white, that society privileged you, and if you were black, then society did not. But this is not just, we can say it's economic, we could say slavery is political, but it also has its effect in society. It has its effect on culture, because what this helped give rise to was a sense of racial superiority by whites. And this was not just a justification to enslave Africans, but also a way for which whites in the English colonies had somewhat of a common ground based on their racial identity. And this was true in practically all of the 13 English colonies, in addition to the English colonies in the West Indies. So in talking about the Atlantic slave trade, again, kind of reviewing some of the stuff that we talked about already, Portugal was the one to bring the first African slaves to the New World. Then it went to the Dutch, and then it went to the English. So by the time you get to the 1700s, most slaves arriving from Africa, being bought from Africa, and being sold to the New World are arriving more and more on English ships. They essentially had taken over the trade from the Dutch. Recall that the English took over New York or New Amsterdam from the Dutch in a series of wars in the late 1600s. Well, as part of those wars, the English also take over a lot of the Dutch's economic ventures in the West, and that includes the Atlantic slave trade. Now, the English king, James II, had allowed for this company, the Royal African Company, to have a monopoly on the transatlantic slave trade. However, James II was forced to relinquish his throne in the Glorious Revolution, if you'll recall, and that monopoly ended. So what that meant was that many English companies could now engage in the African slave trade. And so that increased the number of slaves in the English colonies, right? So you really, especially after 1689, you see an increase in the slave trade. And this is, again, primarily where slaves are ending up is the West Indies. But oftentimes, as a slave, you could be brought on the Middle Passage. Middle Passage, recall, is the trip from Africa to the West Indies. And then you might be traded to one of the 13 colonies, right? We recall that crucial year 1619. That's when the first African slaves arrive to the English colonies in North America. Those slaves arrived from the Caribbean, from the West Indies, not directly from Africa. The Middle Passage often involved this trip and then arriving perhaps via the West Indies to the 13 colonies. Life as a slave was incredibly difficult, incredibly disruptive, and in fact, just downright deadly. The Middle Passage claimed anywhere from 15 to 25% of all people. That's not a very good 25. So 15 to 25% of all the people who were bought from Africa and then brought across the Atlantic Ocean died on that trip because there was a lot of uncertainty with life. The two cornerstones were really family and culture. These were the ways that slave communities and families stayed together. And resistance was more or less done at all times, at any time. And resistance took a lot of different forms. It could be simple day-to-day resistance. We might refer to this as silent sabotage, where you try to sabotage the effort to make money by the slave owner. It could be running away, which was the most effective form of resistance. We talked about how running away led to the creation of maroon communities. Maroon communities were communities in which runaway slaves created and lived separately, independently in places like Jamaica and places like the Americas, where they were able to escape, but also violence. And the most notable instance of violent rebellion by slaves in the English 13 colonies, that is the colonies that eventually became America, was the Stono Rebellion in 1739, where a group of slaves rose up and killed free white individuals attempting to escape and eventually make it to Florida, I believe. That rebellion was eventually put down by the militia. Practically all of these states had militias who were there initially to fight against Native Americans, but later on, especially in the slave colonies, were there to make sure that slave rebellions didn't break out. And those that were not killed in the skirmish were eventually captured and either executed or exiled from the colony. And one of the key themes that we'll find in the English colonies is that anytime one of these rebellions breaks out, especially a violent one, is that it's followed up with stricter laws. And stricter laws may prohibit a certain number of slaves from, meeting. So we'll say assembly. Oops. It may prohibit things like literacy. It may prohibit certain, we might say, property from being owned or held. And these laws are really designed to discourage violent rebellions and to enforce and uphold the system of slavery in the 13 English colonies. Another key important event, or another event related to this, is the New York conspiracy trials. Now, we don't typically think of New York as being a colony which relied very heavily on slave labor, but we do have to remember that it was New York that had previously belonged to the Dutch, and New Amsterdam, as it was called, was an important trading port along the way. So you did have at least enough slaves living there that it gave the white population there in New York fear that there might be a rumored slave revolt. And this really began to stir up when a series of fires broke out. And the rumor was that Roman Catholic missionaries were encouraging a slave revolt. Again, we have to recall some of the ways that England fits in and their conflicts with the rest of the world, that England and Spain are great rivals, right? Spain is actually in possession of Florida. England is Protestant. Spain is Catholic. And so the presence, and remember the Dutch and the Netherlands, right? They were religiously tolerant. So you had maybe a presence of Catholics in New York that you didn't really have anywhere else. And so these series of events, paranoia about a rumored slave revolt, a series of fires that broke out in New York, a potential theory about how Catholic missionaries were trying to encourage slaves to rise up and kill their white Protestant masters, led to a series of trials in which you had a number of slaves and a small number of Catholic missionaries put on trial for this, found guilty on very little evidence, and eventually executed. This image right here is showing one of the people who was killed for being part of this conspiracy. And, by all of our accounts today, it is unlikely that, in fact, a conspiracy existed. But it does show you the amount of hysteria and paranoia that really sort of plagued the minds and hearts of the free white population, whether it was in New York, South Carolina, or whatever colony that we're talking about here. We'll talk more about slavery in a later chapter. One other thing to kind of end this section here, the colonial, that should be a T, the colonial gentry and the consumer revolution. Consumer or consumption means to buy. And in the colonies, you did have enough of a class that could engage in buying finished products from from Europe and the transatlantic world, that you had the distinction of what we call a gentry or a colonial elite. This might be the wealthy and educated, right? They tried to emulate the aristocracy or the royalty from England. Recall that in Europe, it was, bloodlines were very important. It was royalty. If you're born to a certain bloodline, you inherited all of your wealth. The United States is different. The colonies didn't have royalty. There were no barons of New York. I mean, you did have maybe some English royalty move over, but this gentry, this colonial elite, tried to make themselves kind of emulate this royal, this royal class, this upper class, this rich class, this educated class. And of course, they bought giant mansions and sophisticated furniture and painting and, everything else. And even though the gentry sort of set themselves apart as the elite, you did have enough people in England who were able to buy products from overseas. Tea was a huge one. Tea came from places like India, and in the colonies you had colonists drinking and buying lots of tea like their counterparts in England. Printed materials were very important. Printed materials were widely circulated in some forms, or some examples that the textbook talks about. The Cato letters are more political in nature, whereas you had publications like Mr. Spectator or Robin Crusoe, which were much more like leisure. But the abundance of printed materials made it very easy for information to spread around the colonies. And of course, one of the important things to note is that when the ideas of the revolution hit the 13 colonies, because there is so much printed materials and because it's such a part of the culture and the leisure, that those ideas are going to spread very, very quickly.